ES Audio.
From the Evening Standard in London, I'm John Weeks, and this is The Leader.
The all-new smartphone, now with twice the RAM and 4
here
cameras.
it is, the latest model with a new 4 times quicker processor.
The all-new tablet with more features than ever.
Don't be left behind by our most high-tech model yet.
Moore's law states that the number of transistors on a microchip doubles about every 2 years. A theory that effectively suggests technology will get faster and more powerful exponentially. And we're seeing it happen in front of our eyes. Every year we get several new upgraded iterations of smartphones, tablets, computers, even down to things like earphones and hairdryers. But what connects all of those things? Microchips. And what do all microchips need? Precious metals. And where do they come from? Well, it turns out there's quite a lot of them sitting underneath a city in Scandinavia. Just west of the snowy mountains in Sweden lies a city quite literally on the move. Once a small mining town, the city of Kiruna is now being relocated, building by building, to accommodate more mining for things like iron ore and the precious metals you'd find in your smartphone.
We are quite pragmatic here in Kiruna. Of course, we do it because the mine is so important for us as a working place. And we are quite used to changes also. So there wasn't any big fuss about it. We accept it.
Nina Eliason is the head of planning for Kiruna, which is not the first place in Europe being relocated for mining activity.
This is actually not unique. There is one more town being moved at the same time by the same company, and it's in Gällivare and Malmberget. It's like 110 kilometers from Kiruna. So what are the odds that you have to move 2 towns at the same time? But then if you look in Europe, there are some smaller villages that has been moved because of the coal mines, for example in Germany, but not in this large scale as it is in Kiruna.
As with any mining though, concerns about the environment are often raised, and the operation in Kiruna is no different.
Of course it has really big impact, and I think these questions have been more and more discussed than it was before. Before it was like, just do it, just dig this hole and take out the minerals, but now they're quite long processes. And it's because of the Swedish law also that you have to do it in a certain order, of course. The biggest impact is, of course, on the Sami culture, the reindeer herding. And that is something that we try to discuss quite a lot right now. How can we compensate the effects on this national interest that it is?
So why move the buildings already there instead of rebuilding the city elsewhere?
I get quite a lot of questions about why we move the buildings, and I think quite many think that we are moving it because it's cheaper, but the truth is it's not cheaper. It's much more expensive to move a building than building a new one, like a copy, for example. The second one is that people think the reason why we move buildings is because of fast housing. That is not true either. The real reason why we are moving buildings is actually to compensate another national interest, the national interest of cultural heritage. So actually it's compensation for that one why we are moving the buildings. And it's about 40 buildings that are going to be moved in the end. It's not all the buildings, it's just some of the buildings that has really historical values.
So, for the effort it takes to move a whole Swedish city, you'd expect the mine you're planning to enter to have a lot of what you're looking for.
North of the old city center of Kiruna, there is a deposit called Per Geijer. We have known for a long time there were iron ore in that deposit, and that there were phosphorus and rare earth elements, but we haven't known the volume of it because we haven't drilled that much historically. The last 2 or 3 years we have drilled a lot, exploration drilling. You take up samples of the rock and you can see what's down there. And now we see that besides a lot of iron ore and a lot of phosphorus, there's rare earth elements, the biggest deposit of rare earth elements in Europe.
Anders Lindberg is from LKAB, the Swedish mining company preparing to tackle Europe's largest deposit of rare earth metals, a source of many materials that can be used for everything from electronics to food production.
We are going to start extracting phosphorus and rare earth elements. And phosphorus is important for mineral fertilizers. Half of the food that's grown in the world is dependent on mineral fertilizers, and phosphorus is one of the key elements in that. And this deposit alone, the Perjeje deposit, if we get the permits to start extracting it, we can replace all of the Russian export of phosphorus to the EU.
On top of phosphorus, the site is also full of precious metals that can be used in all kinds of technology.
Yeah, that's true. The rare earth elements, there are 17 of them, which have different funny names, and they aren't actually that rare. They are quite common in the rock all around the world, but in very low grades. So they are mostly not profitable to mine. But here we have a higher grade, and it's an iron ore body, it will be profitable to extract them. But they are important, as you say, for the electrification of our society, going green, using less fossil fuel. When we want to electrify, for example, vehicles, we have to make permanent magnets that are important for electrical cars. We need these kinds of elements.
Eco groups such as Earthworks argue that new mining should be the last resort for supplying minerals. So can we recycle what we already have instead?
These metals and minerals are very important, and there is not enough of them to recycle. Recycling is always good, and that should be the goal for us to recycle as much as we can. I know that a lot of people are skeptical about new mines, but we will need them. If we are to lower the use of fossil fuel, to lower the climate change, we need to go electric, and then we need these metals and minerals.
Let's take a break now. In part 2, we turn our attention to e-waste recycling itself and whether it's an option at all. So, when you decide to upgrade your smartphone or laptop, ever think about what happens to your old one? Well, data from USwitch estimates that 80% goes to landfills or incinerators. In 2022, data shows 37,000 tonnes of e-waste was generated in the UK alone, and that's set to rise to 54,000 by 2030. And it's estimated that just 12.5% of e-waste in the UK is recycled. So just how much of a smartphone, for example, can actually be recycled?
A great deal of it can be harvested through a number of different processes. Initially, mechanical processes, and then sort of later on refinement and sort of more chemical treatments. But the vast majority of it can be recovered somewhere. The question really is not, is it technically possible to recover all of it? It's whether it's economically viable.
Robbie Staniforth is the Innovation and Policy Director at Ecosurety, a company aiming to improve our recycling infrastructure and public awareness of recycling.
The reality is, lots of electronics recycling is a fairly agricultural process involving shredders and float tanks where they sink or float the different types of plastic polymers to remove the plastic from all the metal that's left. And so in an agricultural process, it doesn't really matter which ones. But if you want a high recycling rate, you really need to get the chips separated in the most sort of viable way possible so that you've got the chips on their own.
And as if the process wasn't complicated enough, it turns out actually getting access to the chips is harder than it should be.
The products aren't designed or set up to easily get access to those chips. So if you look at your laptop in front of you now, it would take you quite a bit of time to open the carcass up and access where the predominant precious metals are, which is in those chips. So really the issue is that the products haven't been designed to be dismantled and access that chip very easily. If they were designed to be more accessible, then suddenly the viability increases.
So, once the chips are out and the recycling begins, there's still another part of most devices that needs dealing with, the battery. But that's normally the part that's the toughest to actually recycle.
When you recycle a battery, what would be known as a lithium battery, you're pulling out aluminium, copper, manganese, cobalt, nickel, and also the lithium itself. So this just gives you an idea of the complexity. Those are all very different materials that you're trying to harvest in their purest form, because if you can harvest them in their purest form, they can go back into any application whatsoever.
So once these substances are recycled, are they good enough, and do tech firms even want them?
They just see the material as exactly or very similar to the stuff that they would be buying from the sort of primary sources that's been mined. So I think to most companies, the material properties of the various cobalt, nickel, lithium, aluminium, it's a very similar compound to what they'd be using anyway. So I don't think there's any resistance there. I think it's all about the economics.
So, how do you make the economics work? Well, one option is for governments to step in and make new legislation around recycled materials.
We don't really have policies in the UK that mandate using recycled materials, so therefore the decision to include recycled material is often just based on the pure economics. And as I mentioned earlier, it can be much more expensive to harvest those metals from previous products through a recycling process than it is to pull it out of a hole in the ground. That's changing as time goes on and as the industry standardizes and modernizes and becomes more efficient in those recycling chain processes. But ultimately it's competing against an industry, the mining and extraction industry, that's been going for hundreds of years.
That's The Leader. Thanks for listening. We're back on Tuesday afternoon at 4 o'clock.